The Magical Power of the Saints, Evocation and Candle Rituals by Reverend Ray T. Malbrough. I'm going to start at chapter 3. Honoring the Ancestors and the Dead. This may be labeled by many as ancestor worship and condemned by fundamentalist Christians, but Roman Catholic teaching says, although the souls in purgatory cannot merit, they are able to pray and obtain the fruit of prayer. The power of their prayers depends on their sanctity. It is certain that they can pray and obtain blessings for those living on earth. They are united with the Pilgrim Church in the communion of saints. Printed instructions for novenas and prayers for the dead can be found at any Catholic religious supply house. I was raised using the novena written by Saint Alphonsus de Liguori, which contained a different prayer for each of the 9 days of the novena, plus a rosary for the dead and another set of general prayers for each weekday. In the second book of Maccabees, chapter 12, verses 42 through 46, we read about the ancient Jewish custom of offering prayers and sacrifices on behalf of the dead. This custom is still carried over into some Christian teaching, but frowned upon by most Protestant Christians. The first and second books of Maccabees were removed by King James from his authorized version of the Holy Bible, the version which most Protestants today read. For close to 90% of the world's population, ritual offerings and prayers to defunct blood relatives form an integral part of everyday living. The practice is universal in nature, common to people raised in Eastern cultures such as the Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, and Tibetans, as well as large segments of South America, Mexico, Cuba, Haiti, in the indigenous religions of Africa, Bali, Indonesia, Polynesia, Mongolia, spreading into Europe, into the Baltic states and Iceland, as well as among the ancient Celtic peoples whose modern descendants still carry on customs associated with the dead to this very day. Honoring the ancestors can provide you with knowledge that all of life is a continuum, and enable you to actually communicate with the energy of your departed family members. Any form of communicating with the dead is called necromancy. The practice of necromancy does involve conjuring up the spirit of a defunct personage to obtain information about a future event. This is often pointed out in 1 Samuel 28, chapters 7 through 25, when King Saul consulted the woman of Endor. Biblical scripture calls this woman a witch, but in reality she was a necromancer, revealed in verse 11 when she asked King Saul, "Whom do you want me to conjure up?" There is not a genuine witch that I personally know of who practices this sort of communication with the dead. The footnote in my Catholic Bible states clearly that human beings cannot communicate at will with the souls of the departed. God may permit a departed soul to appear to the living and even to disclose things unknown to them. In most instances, the deceased will communicate with their living family members through dreams or oneromancy. In my own experience, one afternoon I was taking a nap. I dreamed that my mother, 2 of my brothers who are currently living, and I went to visit my grandmother. Now, my grandmother has been deceased for 6 years prior to this dream. In the dream, before going to my grandmother's house, we stopped at the home of a relative living on the same street for a short visit. My brothers had disappeared, so I set off to look for them and found them playing in the backyard of our grandmother's house. I noticed that the back door was open, so I went inside to look around. When entering, I saw my grandmother sitting in the living room, and I said, "Oh, Grandma, you're home." Then she said to me, "Yes, I've been waiting for you. Where's your mom?" I said, "She is down the street visiting Alice. I'll go get her and tell her that you are home." My grandmother replied, "Fine. I'll cook some ground beef for y'all to eat when you get back. But I want you to play numbers 6, 3, and 7 in the lotto. There I woke up. Every day I played the numbers given in the dream, except for the following Saturday. I was so busy that day that by the time I was able to purchase my ticket, it was too late for the night's lotto drawing. That night, the numbers given to me in the dream were drawn. Had I been able to play the numbers, I would have been $500 richer. New Testament scripture gives a good example of Jesus communicating with the dead. Of course, Protestant ministers and some Catholics will never bring this to your attention. In Matthew 17, 1 through 3, we read, After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, conversing to him. From Old Testament scripture, we know that Moses died and was buried, for God knows how many centuries passed. It is written in Deuteronomy 34 and 5. So there in the land of Moab, Moses, the servant of the Lord, died as the Lord had said. Therefore it is an accepted practice by God when the dead come of their own free will to communicate with the living. If Jesus, who is supposed to be without sin, did it, then it is permitted by God for others to do so. And yes, the deceased can literally appear before the living. God permitting the dead to communicate with the living, as in the case of Moses appearing before Jesus in the sight of Peter, James, and John. In my own experience, I have seen during a spirit session, as we were praying for the dead, the spirit of a man appear behind the woman sitting opposite from me. As the male spirit put his arm around the woman, she shuddered and made a sound. The woman asked me what I was looking at when she saw me staring, and my mouth opened wide. After I described the male spirit who had hugged her, the woman left the room, then came back with 2 pictures, asking me if one of the men I had described was in either of these 2 pictures. The picture I verified as the spirit I saw was that of her husband, who had been dead for 15 years. There was no practice of conjuring up the dead in this form of necromancy, nor in the case when Moses appeared to Jesus. Conjuring up the dead is not a practice of a diviner priest or priestess. Neither is it a practice of genuine witches practicing their religion today. At Samhain, the eve of November 1st, during the religious celebration honoring the departed ancestors, they are not conjured up, but instead they are invited to come forward if they wish to give a message and partake of any offerings of food, flowers, glasses of water, and candies dedicated to their memory. It is commonly believed that on this night, the veil between the world of the living and the dead is very thin, making it possible to communicate with the deceased of their own free will, not our wills. The deceased can communicate with the living at any time they wish. The technique of sortilege I learned has a pattern that will give a clue that an ancestral spirit may wish to communicate something on behalf of a client situation. If so, then any answer given through the sortilege afterward will be that of a deceased blood relative speaking. There is no conjuring up the dead involved here, because the deceased is coming of their own free will. It may be that the client must take the problem to the ancestors for help in solving the situation. Therefore, all prayers and offerings will be dedicated to them. To do this requires almost daily communication with your deceased blood relatives and offerings periodically given to them. Bridging the gap of communication with the ancestors is really quite simple. To begin, you should get a detailed list of all your blood relatives, as complete as possible. You will also need to have the discipline to set aside in the same day at least 13 minutes of prayer. A white candle is lit for the ancestors and a clear glass of water set out. Your prayer should go something like this. Blessing to all my departed ancestors. I pay my respect to my great-great-grandparents. Say each name 3 times. I pay respect to my grandparents. Say each name 3 times. I pay respects to my great-grandparents. Say each name 3 times. I pay respect to my great aunts, my great uncles, to my aunts, to my uncles. I pay respects to my deceased father or mother. Say their names 3 times. Then proceed by saying something like, accept this cool water that you may have refreshment. Accept this light and energy so that you may have comfort and strength. Your presence is greatly missed here on earth. Forget not your posterity. May you continue to bring to us your guidance and wisdom, peace in our lives, health and prosperity for your homes. Most individuals set a table covered with a white cloth in a corner of the room. On this table are placed as many photographs of their blood relatives as possible. I remember in the early 1960s seeing in people's homes photos of the deceased in their coffins. In fact, an aunt of mine has a painting of my grandmother made from a photograph of her in her coffin. In the portrait painting, her eyes are closed. This custom has died out recently. It is criticized as a morbid practice. It is permissible for you yourself to be in the picture, but not any other living person. To do so could hasten that person's early demise, and you could be held accountable spiritually for murder. Many people place on their ancestral shrine favorite objects associated with the deceased relative. Whatever item you choose must have in your mind a strong association with the deceased person. It is the practice to keep a vigil light burning at all times for the deceased, but it is not necessary. You may extinguish the candle after your prayer time is over and relight it the next day. The glass of water is changed every 7 or 9 days, as the water slowly evaporates during this period of time. It symbolizes your ancestors drinking. It is not necessary to have pictures of your ancestors to have a formal shrine dedicated to them. All that is really needed is the water, candles, and your prayers. Many people use white flowers as an offering on their ancestral altar. Other offerings might include fruit, a portion of cooked food, especially a favorite food of the ancestor, coffee, rum, wine, cigarettes, honey, cane, syrup, pastries, or anything else you feel they might like. It will take at least 6 months of prayer and weekly offerings to begin to make any real contact in communicating with the ancestors. If you think that you hear spirits talking to you, avoid talking to them. Continue the offerings and ask for help and guidance, and thank them for the guidance they give. The reason you avoid speaking to any spirits who may be speaking to you is that while you may think it is your ancestors speaking, the voices you hear may be trickster spirits and not your deceased relatives at all. In spite of your conviction that you can tell the difference between the voices of trickster spirits and your ancestors, you will not be able to do so. The proof that you are communicating with your defunct blood relatives and not trickster spirits is that after about a year, your life will be flowing in a smoother manner with less trauma. After you have done your daily prayers for the first 9 days, you can begin to discuss your problems with your ancestors. Do not insult them by asking for help in buying a new outfit or a pair of shoes, or even to compel your lover to call you that night. It is appropriate to ask them to intervene only in life's serious problems, such as with the loss of a job, illness, etc. If you are not involved in a serious situation for the moment, simply ask them for continued guidance, health, prosperity for your home, and peace. Honoring your ancestors is 1/3 of the power of a diviner, priest, or princess. The other 2/3 of the power comes from your relationship with the nature and elemental spirits, and from your relationship with divinity.